Good morning. I'm glad you all are here today. As a second-year teacher, classroom management is something I'm still trying to refine and to adjust, especially with my classroom rules and procedures. So I did a little research and I found 20 articles and texts that really helped me find themes for effective classroom rules and procedures to make my classroom the best environment for each student's learning. So I would like to share some of my findings with you today in hopes that it'll also help your classroom management. Classroom management really has to do with us as teachers finding ways to help our students learn to the best of their ability. And behavior modification is really what we're doing when we manage our classroom. We're identifying students' maladaptive behaviors and looking for ways to correct those by enforcing adaptive behaviors to override those maladaptive behaviors. In other words, we want students to find behaviors that are appropriate, that replace their inappropriate behaviors in order to make our classroom successful for their learning and for their peers' learning. It's important to establish good classroom rules and procedures for a smooth classroom environment, make the classroom transitions run smoother, and just to have an overall comfortable and welcoming, easy learning environment. This can also help us manage a classroom that's the most conducive to student learning. So some characteristics that I found throughout my research for effective rules include they need to be few in number. If we have a bunch of rules posted on our board, students are not going to remember each rule. And it's more effective if we have a few solid, specific rules that they can commit to memory and follow throughout the school year. It's also important that those rules are clearly stated. If they're really long paragraph style rules, students are not going to read it. Students are not going to remember every component. So we need to make sure our rules are clear and concise, but specific. We want them to know exactly what we mean and exactly what we expect when they come into our classroom. We need to teach these rules, not just display them and refer to them in 5 minutes on the first day. That's not going to be effective for managing our classroom. We've got to teach these rules intentionally and make sure students commit them to memory. And not just do that on the first day of school, but continually and constantly reinforce those as needed throughout the school year. Same thing with classroom procedures. Now, procedures are a little different than rules. Rules are our expectations that we expect students to follow for a smooth learning environment. Classroom procedures are procedures that make the classroom run more smoothly. Procedures can include entering and exiting the classroom in a smooth and quick manner. It can also include students leaving the classroom for a restroom break or having to take something to the office during class. It can also include fire drills, tornado drills, intruder drills, any emergency component, any emergency evacuation system that the school has in place. It can also include asking for help, and that can be help from us as the teachers, help from aides or paraprofessionals, or help from peers. They need to know how to turn in papers. Everybody's not going to rush to the door or rush to the basket to turn them in at once. We need procedures for fluid movement throughout the classroom that eliminates distraction and eliminates traffic jams and lost instructional time. Students also need to know how to obtain materials needed for the lesson and how to return those materials back to the appropriate places. Just like rules, procedures need to be taught intentionally and revisited throughout the school year. As we're making our rules and procedures, some things that we need to keep in mind are cultural and diversity differences throughout our classroom. It's becoming increasingly more diverse as we move throughout the years. Since I've been in school till now I'm a teacher, I've seen a drastic increase in the diversity in classrooms. And that's a great thing. We need to be proud and excited that that's happening. But we need to be mindful of the differences in our norms and students' norms coming from those different backgrounds. Our norms are not going to be theirs. In some cases they might be, but I have 3 instances where they were not as I was preparing my classroom rules and procedures. One student was taught that eye contact to an authority figure was disrespectful. Well, I was raised that you make eye contact with authority figures and adults, that was respectful, and you maintain that eye contact through the discussion. The student was not raised that way, and it made them very uncomfortable that that's what I expected. So I had to do a little tweaking with that instance. Another student that I had was not taught to raise their hand or ask for permission to speak in a group setting, in a classroom setting. That was fine for their family, for their instances at home and their instances out in public. It's not okay in a classroom of 26 students. That's just not going to work if every student just blurts out all the time. So we had to come to a compromise on raising your hand to ask for permission to speak, or at least raising your hand before blurting out the thought or comment. Some students are raised in a group-oriented environment. I have one student this year in particular who lives in a house with grandparents, 2 or 3 sets of aunts and uncles, a bunch of cousins, and both parents and siblings. Well, that's great. They have a very close-knit family and they're very involved in our community, and we're very thankful for them. But the independent assignments in classrooms make her very uncomfortable. She's used to the family environment. She's used to working together to get things done. And in some instances, that's great. But for our independent assignments, she gets very nervous and very stressed out. So we've had to come up with rules and procedures that keep that in mind. Actually, we have come up with a way for her to ask for my help or to work with the peers at her table without obtaining answers from them. So she's a little more at ease knowing she's got that option to fall back on. As I researched the behavior management articles and texts, I found some themes in creating classroom rules and procedures that are most effective in enhancing students' learning, and I'd like to share those with you. So first, the theme that appeared probably most often in the literature I researched was giving students a role in creating the rules and procedures. Now, if you're like me, giving that control to students is really scary. I like to have control of my classroom, and I like for everything to run smoothly and in my manner and in my way and in my control. But if you give students that freedom to participate in the classroom rules and creating the classroom procedures, they get that sense of ownership. They're excited. It's their rules, it's their procedures, it's not the teachers. And so they've got that sense of ownership that, hey, we've made these and we're going to follow them because they're ours, because we made them. And they're more likely to follow the rules and procedures because they made them. Students also feel that personal connection when they're part of the creation process for rules and procedures. They know that they picked the rules and they discussed what procedures were best for their learning, for their classroom, and for their peers. And they knew that it was relevant and important, or they wouldn't have brought it up as a classroom discussion that we need those rules. So they're personally connected to those and are going to ensure that other students follow them and that they follow them because they're their rules. If you are like me, as I was reading this, I was sweating a little because I was really stressed out about giving students free rein for developing my classroom rules and procedures. I've got 3 class periods. They're coming in and out constantly throughout the day. I'm not going to let one group of students control the learning environment for the rest of the 2 groups. That's not me as a teacher, and that's not appropriate for the other 2 classes. So I found one article that discussed having an outline of the rules that you think are important, 4, 5, or 6 that you know you want students to choose. You know that they're the rules that you'll feel comfortable with. So outline those and then guide students in a discussion toward those rules. They won't have any idea that you're pushing them to their rules. They'll think that they came up with them, and that's what we want because we want them to have that ownership. But you're actually facilitating the discussion, making them discuss these rules, why they're important and why they're relevant to their learning in their classroom. Another theme that I found was with rules come consequences, and we're used to seeing consequences. They were probably a little more harsh as we were growing up than they are now. That's just the way society is, and we'll deal with it, and we'll smile and grin and find consequences that are appropriate for today's youth. So with consequences, they're not going to look the same for everyone. And I found this out the hard way. My first year teaching last year, I had a student that was breaking one of my rules repeatedly. And so I had this student sit out of recess. Well, they kept breaking my rule repeatedly, and I could not figure out what was going on. Finally, one day, I decided that I would keep the study hall. We usually have somebody that keeps it for us, but I thought, no, I'm going to see what this student's doing, that he keeps repeating the same rule, wanting the same consequence, and staying inside instead of going to recess, because I was a recess kid when I was younger. So I stayed in, kept the study hall. Student read the entire time. They wanted that time to read. They didn't want to go play basketball or kickball or play on the swings. They wanted to read their book. So I was actually rewarding this student for breaking my rules because I wasn't taking the time to see that they saw this as a reward, not a consequence. I also had an incident with another teacher. We were discussing actually the student that wanted to read instead of play. And she said, oh my gosh, I've had the same thing. I set a kid out for silent lunch. They sit in the office instead of going to the lunchroom. That's great, but they kept repeating the maladaptive behavior and the inappropriate behavior. Come to find out, the student hated the noisy lunchroom. He wanted that silent time. He wanted time to debrief from his peers. He wanted the quiet time to reflect on how his day was going. So it was a reward for him too. So we need to be mindful of what students see as rewards and what students see as consequences. And we can do that by building strong relationships with our students. Now, I'm a big proponent of building relationships with students, but this made it even more important to me because I can see through these relationships what matters to students, what drives them, what motivates them, what makes them happy, what upsets them, what makes them reflect on their behaviors. And building these relationships can help me set both consequences and rewards for each student. Now, no, this is not equal. Each student will not get the same consequence, but each student will get a fair consequence for breaking the rule or procedure that they did. Throughout the year, we have to reteach these rules and procedures. Now, I know on day one, we've got to drill these rules and procedures. They've got to know from the moment they walk in what we expect as teachers and what we expect of them as a classroom to have the best learning environment. And that's absolutely true. But we can't stop on day one or week one. We've got to continue revisiting and reteaching these rules and procedures throughout the year. We have long breaks. And we've got students that forget, and our environment becomes more relaxed throughout the year. So we've got to reteach these rules so students keep them fresh in their mind and committed to their memories so they continue to comply with the rules. One teacher made a blog post that I found interesting. She called it Flipping Her Classroom. And she made little snippet videos that she thought were refresher courses. And she used it for both whole group and for individual instruction. She would play the video as a reminder. And she jokingly said after 5 or 6 times, students started following the rules so they wouldn't have to watch the videos. We must be reflective. That's part of our job as teachers. And no matter what we are doing, whether it be instruction, whether it be planning, whether it be classroom management, we have to reflect on what we're doing well and what we're doing wrong. So we've got to constantly adjust and continuously reflect on how we can better our rules and procedures. This is especially true for new teachers like myself. We're not going to have it all together to start with, so we've got to constantly refine and reflect on what we're doing. As a school, we must also reflect on settings outside of the classroom. Rules and procedures we can implement there that are still culturally respectful and mindful of our diversity. And we as teachers must model what we expect. We can't tell a student to do something that we're not willing to do ourselves. We've got to model that desired behavior. Here are a few helpful resources that I found particularly interesting. They will be in the PowerPoint references at the end with links, but I wanted you to see kind of an overview of some of the most important and most helpful ones for me. I will be happy to email this PowerPoint to you all so you will have the links and can look at these references yourself. Thank you so much for listening.